right, y'all. Today we are going to be going over Chapter 15 of A People's History of the United States. Chapter 15 is titled Self-Help in Hard Times. At the onset here, this chapter is primarily about how the people organized to bring commerce, capitalism, all of that to a halt. How the people organized, inspired each other to remember that nothing worked without them. This was a very inspiring chapter. It got me thinking a lot about why union busting has become so intense, because the government knows that when the people organize, nothing can happen until they say go. Money, profit, all of that is put on pause until the people get what they want. Now, of course, just as the people organized, government organized, factory owners organized. It didn't come without resistance. And so that's what we're gonna see. My hope is that this creates some level of inspiration within y'all to remember that even though we have to work jobs, even though we have to be a part of the system, if we come together, we can change it. We have to modify it to reflect the modern times, but we do have the power. We do have the power. The war was hardly over. It was February 1919. The IWW leadership was in jail, but the IWW idea of the general strike became reality for 5 days in Seattle, Washington, when a walkout of 100,000 working people brought the city to a halt. The city now stopped functioning except for activities organized by the strikers to provide essential needs. Firemen agreed to stay on the job. Laundry workers handled only hospital laundry. Vehicles authorized to move carried signs exempted by the General Strike Committee. 35 neighborhood milk stations were set up, and every day 30,000 meals were prepared in large kitchens, then transported to halls all over the city and served cafeteria style, with strikers paying 25 cents a meal. The general public 35 cents. People were allowed to eat as much as they wanted of the beef stew, spaghetti, bread, and coffee. Can you imagine if that was the thing where people were able to be fed every single day, where the public was able to eat well-balanced meals? Do you know how many people are starving in the United States of America right now? A labor war veterans guard was organized to keep the peace. On the blackboard at one of its headquarters was written, "The purpose of this organization is to preserve law and order without the use of force. No volunteer will have any police power or be allowed to carry weapons of any sort, but to use persuasion only." During the strike, crime in the city decreased. The commander of the United States Army detachment sent into the area told the strikers committee that in 40 years of military experience, he hadn't seen so quiet and orderly a city. In Centralia, Washington, where the IWW had been organizing lumber workers, the lumber interests made plans to get rid of the IWW. On November 11th, 1919, Armistice Day, the Legion paraded through town with rubber hoses and gas pipes, and the IWW prepared for an attack. When the Legion passed the IWW hall, shots were fired. It is unclear who fired first. They stormed the hall. There was more firing, and 3 Legion men were killed. Inside the headquarters was an IWW member, a lumberjack named Frank Everett, who had been in France as a soldier while the IWW national leaders were on trial for obstructing the war effort. Everett was in army uniform and carrying a rifle. He emptied it into the crowd and ran for the woods, followed by a mob. He started to wade across the river, found the current too strong, turned, shot the leading man dead, threw his gun into the river, and fought the mob with his fists. They dragged him back to town behind an automobile, suspended him from a telegraph pole, took him down, locked him in jail. That night, his jailhouse door was broken down. He was dragged out, put on the floor of a car. His were cut off, and then he was taken to a bridge, hanged, and his body riddled with bullets. No one was ever arrested for Everett's murder, but 11 Wobblies were put on trial for killing an American Legion leader during the parade, and 6 of them spent 15 years in prison. Why such a reaction to the general strike, to the organizing of the Wobblies? A statement by the mayor of Seattle suggests that the establishment feared not just the strike itself, but what it symbolized. He said, The so-called sympathetic Seattle strike was an attempted revolution. That there was no violence does not alter the fact. The intent, openly and covertly announced, was for the overthrow of the industrial system. Here first, then everywhere. True, there were no flashing guns, no bombs, no killings. Revolution, I repeat, does not need violence. The general strike, as practiced in Seattle, is of itself the weapon of revolution, all the more dangerous because quiet. To succeed, it must suspend everything, stop the entire life stream of a community. That is to say, it puts the government out of operation, and that is all there is to revolt, no matter how achieved. In the steel mills of western Pennsylvania later in 1919, where men worked 12 hours a day, 6 days a week, doing exhausting work under intense heat, 100,000 steel workers were signed up in 20 different AFL craft unions. A national committee attempting to tie them together in their organizing drive found in the summer of 1919, the men are letting it be known that if we do not do something for them, they will take the matter into their own hands. There was pressure from President Woodrow Wilson and Samuel Gompers, AFL president, to postpone the strike. But the steelworkers were too insistent, and in September 1919, not only the 100,000 union men, but 250,000 others went out on strike. The sheriff of Allegheny County swore in as deputies 5,000 employees of U.S. Steel who had not gone on strike, and announced that outdoor meetings would be forbidden. A report of the Interchurch World Movement made at the time said, in Monessen, the policy of the state police was simply to club men off the streets and drive them into their homes. In Braddock, when a striker was clubbed in the street, he would be taken to jail, kept there overnight. Many of those arrested in Newcastle were ordered not to be released until the strike was over. Other factors operated against the strikers. Most were recent immigrants of many nationalities, many languages. Sherman Service Inc., hired by the steel corporations to break the strike, instructed its men in South Chicago. We want you to stir up as much bad feeling as you possibly can between the Serbians and the Italians. Spread data among the Serbians that the Italians are going back to work. Urge them to go back to work or the Italians will get their jobs. More than 30,000 black workers were brought into the area as strikebreakers. They had been excluded from AFL unions and so felt no loyalty to unionism. In the year following the war, 120,000 textile workers struck in New England and in New Jersey, and 30,000 silk workers struck in Paterson, New Jersey. In Boston, the police went out on strike, and in New York, cigar makers, shirt makers, carpenters, bakers, teamsters, and barbers were out on strike. In Chicago, the press reported more strikes and lockouts accompany the midsummer heat than ever known before at any one time. When the 20s began, however, the situation seemed under control. The IWW was destroyed, the Socialist Party falling apart. The strikes were beaten down by force, and the economy was doing just well enough for just enough people to prevent mass rebellion. The KKK was revived in the 1920s, and it spread into the North. By 1924, it had 4.5 million members. The NAACP seemed helpless in the face of mob violence and race hatred everywhere. The impossibility of the black person's ever being considered equal in white America was the theme of the nationalist movement led in the 1920s by Marcus Garvey. He preached black pride, racial separation, and a return to Africa, which to him held the only hope for black unity and survival. But Garvey's movement, inspiring as it was to some blacks, could not make much headway against the powerful white supremacy currents of the post-war decade. There was some truth to the standard picture of the 20s as a time of prosperity and fun, the jazz age, the roaring 20s. Unemployment was down from 4.2 million in 1921 to a little over 2 million in 1927. The general level of wages for workers rose. Some farmers made a lot of money. The 40% of all families who made over $2,000 a year could buy new gadgets, autos, radios, refrigerators. Millions of people were not doing badly, and they could shut out the picture of others, the tenant farmers, black and white, the immigrant families in the big cities, without work or not making enough to get basic necessities. But prosperity was concentrated at the top. While from 1922 to 1929, real wages in manufacturing went up per capita 1.4% a year, the holders of common stocks gained 16.4% a year. 6 million families made less than $1,000 a year. 0.1% of the families at the top received more income as 42% of the families at the bottom, according to a report of the Brookings Institution. There were enough well-off people to push the others into the background, and with the rich controlling the means of dispensing information, who would tell? Women had finally, after long agitation, won the right to vote in 1920 with the passage of the 19th Amendment, but voting was still a middle-class and upper-class activity. Eleanor Flexner, recounting the history of the movement, says the effect of female suffrage was that women have shown the same tendency to divide along orthodox party lines as male voters. During the presidencies of Harding and Coolidge in the 1920s, the Secretary of the Treasury was Andrew Mellon, one of the richest men in America. In 1923, Congress was presented with the Mellon Plan, calling for what looked like a general reduction of income taxes, except that the top income brackets would have their tax rates lowered from 50% to 25%, while the lowest income group would have theirs lowered from 4% to 3%. The Mellon Plan passed. In 1928, LaGuardia toured the poorest districts of New York and said, "I confess I was not prepared for what I actually saw. It seemed almost incredible that such conditions of poverty could really exist." After the war, with the Socialist Party weakened, a Communist Party was organized, and communists were involved in the organization of the Trade Union Education League, which tried to build a militant spirit inside the AFL. When a communist named Ben Gold of the Furriers section of the TUEL challenged the AFL union leadership at a meeting, he was knifed and beaten. The first of the textile strikes was in Tennessee, where 500 women in one mill walked out in protest against wages of $9 to $10 a week. Then, at Gastonia, North Carolina, workers joined a new union, the National Textile Workers Union, led by communists, which admitted both blacks and whites to membership. When some of them were fired, half of the 2,000 workers went out on strike. Atmosphere of anti-communism and racism built up and violence began. Textile strikes began to spread across South Carolina. There, with textile workers living in a tent colony and refusing to renounce the communists and their leadership, the strike went on. The stock market crash of 1929, which marked the beginning of the Great Depression of the United States, came directly from wild speculation, which collapsed and brought the whole economy down with it. But as John Galbraith says in his study of that event, behind that speculation was the fact that the economy was fundamentally unsound. He points to the very unhealthy corporate and banking structures, an unsound foreign trade, much economic misinformation, and the bad distribution of income. A socialist critic would go further and say that the capitalist system was by its nature unsound, a system driven by the overriding motive of corporate profit and therefore unstable, unpredictable, and blind to human needs. The result of all of that: permanent depression for many of its people, and periodic crisis for almost everybody. Capitalism, despite its attempts at self-reform, its organization for better control, was still, in 1929, a sick and undependable system. After the crash, the economy was stunned, barely moving. Over 5,000 banks closed and huge numbers of businesses unable to get money closed too. Those that continued laid off employees and cut the wages of those who remained again and again. Industrial production fell by 50%, and by 1933, perhaps 1/4 or 1/3 of the labor force were out of work. Okay, what are we seeing by now? What we're seeing is that although things were getting better for some people, like the Roaring 20s was a thing. That's why the Great Gatsby, is such a famous tale, because there were certain people that were making a lot of money and living in luxury. There were certain farmers that were making more money. But there were still many communities that were forgotten about, primarily immigrant communities, tenant farmers, the poor working class. And so, yes, unemployment rates were going down, but the money was still concentrated at the top. People were making more money, and there were more people working, and to the point where there were more people that were able to buy cars and that kind of thing. But still, the majority of the money was going to the people at the tippity top. Herbert Hoover had said not long before the crash, the Great Depression, "We in America today are nearer to the final triumph over poverty than ever before in the history of any land." Henry Ford, in March 1931, said the crisis was here because the average man won't really do a day's work unless he is caught and cannot get out of it. There's plenty of work to do if people would do it. A few weeks later, he laid off 75,000 workers. Henry Ford. There were millions of tons of food around, but it was not profitable to transport it, to sell it. Warehouses were full of clothing, but people could not afford it. There were lots of houses, but they stayed empty because people could not pay the rent, had been evicted, and now lived in shacks in quickly formed Hoovervilles built on garbage dumps. Brief glimpses of reality in the newspapers could have been multiplied by the millions. A New York Times story in early 1932 said, after vainly trying to stay out of dispossession until January 15th from his apartment at 46 Hancock Street in Brooklyn, yesterday Peter J. Cornell, 48 years old, a former roofing contractor out of work and penniless, fell dead in the arms of his wife. It's worth reminding y'all that I have to skip some paragraphs and I have to skip some pages. Otherwise, each chapter I would have to make 40 videos for, which I cannot do. And so that's why it's important to actually read the book, because there's more detail that you can get when you're experiencing it yourself. But, I prioritize the most important information, so I hope that still translates. The Roosevelt reforms went far beyond previous legislation. They had to meet two pressing needs: to reorganize capitalism in such a way to overcome the crisis and stabilize the system, also to head off the alarming growth of spontaneous rebellion in the early years of the Roosevelt administration, organization of tenants and the unemployed, movements of self-help, general strikes in several cities. The first objective, to stabilize the system for its own protection, was most obvious in the major law of Roosevelt's first months in office, the National Recovery Act, the NRA. It was designed to take control of the economy through a series of codes agreed on by management, labor, and the government, fixing prices and wages, limiting competition. From the first, the NRA was dominated by big business and served their interests. Its Title I turned much of the nation's power over to highly organized, well-financed trade associations and industrial combines. The unorganized public, otherwise known as the consumer, along with the members of the fledgling trade union movement, had virtually nothing to say about the initial organization of the National Recovery Administration or the formulation of the basic policy. So there was a thing that began kind of coming about that was a self-help organization, or like unemployed councils, where people were coming together to make shit happen. They were like, you know what, we're not going to depend on the government anymore. We can't depend on y'all to save us. And so we're going to take matters into our own hands. It says here, perhaps the most remarkable example of self-help took place in the coal district of Pennsylvania, where teams of unemployed miners dug small mines on company property, mined coal, trucked it to cities, and sold it below the commercial rate. By 1934, 5 million tons of this bootleg coal were produced by 20,000 men using 4,000 vehicles. When attempts were made to prosecute, local juries would not convict, local jailers would not imprison. These were simple actions, taken out of practical need, but they had revolutionary possibilities. Paul Maddock, a Marxist writer, commented, "All that is really necessary for the workers to do in order to end their miseries is to perform such simple things as to take where there is, without regard to established property principles or social philosophies, and to start to produce for themselves. Done on a broad social scale, it will lead to lasting results. On a local, isolated plane, it will be defeated. The bootleg miners have shown in a rather clear and impressive way that the so much bewailed absence of the socialist ideology on the part of the workers really does not prevent workers from acting quite anti-capitalistically, quite in accordance with their own needs. Breaking through the confines of private property in order to live up to their own necessities, the miners' actions is, at the same time, a manifestation of the most important part of class consciousness, namely, that the problems of the workers can be solved only by themselves." Okay, this is the second to last video for chapter 15. In 1934 and 1935, hundreds of thousands of workers left out of the tightly controlled exclusive unions of the American Federation of Labor, the AFL, began organizing in the new mass production industries, auto, rubber packing house. But it was rank and file strikes and insurgencies that pushed the union leadership into action. Jeremy Brecker tells a story in his book Strike. A new kind of tactic began among rubber workers in Akron, Ohio in the early 30s, the sit-down strike. The workers stayed in the plant instead of walking out, and this had clear advantages. They were directly blocking the use of strikebreakers. They did not have to act through union officials, but were in direct control of the situation themselves. They did not have to walk outside in the cold and rain, but had shelter. They were not isolated, as in their work or on the picket line. There were thousands under one roof, free to talk to one another, to form a community of struggle. In early 1936, at the Firestone rubber plant in Akron, makers of truck tires, their wages were already too low to pay for food and rent, were faced with a wage cut. When several union members were fired, others began to stop work, to sit down on the job. In one day, the whole of Plant 1 was sitting down. In 2 days, Plant 2 was sitting down, and management gave in. In the next 10 days, there was a sit-down at Goodyear. A court issued an injunction against mass picketing, and 150 deputies were sworn in, but they soon faced 10,000 workers from all over Akron. In a month, the strike was won. Sidney Fine, in Sit Down, describes what happened. Committees organized recreation, information, classes, a postal service, sanitation. Courts were set up to deal with those who didn't take their turn washing dishes, or who threw rubbish, or who smoked where it was prohibited, or brought in liquor. The punishment consisted of extra duties. The ultimate punishment was expulsion from the plant. A restaurant owner across the street prepared 3 meals a day for 2,000 strikers. There were classes in parliamentary procedure, public speaking, history of the labor movement. Graduates at the University of Michigan gave courses in journalism and creative writing. There were injunctions, but a procession of 5,000 armed workers encircled the plant, and there was no attempt to enforce the injunction. Police attacked with tear gas, and the workers fought back with fire hoses. 13 strikers were wounded by gunfire, but the police were driven back. The governor called out the National Guard. But this time the strike had spread to other General Motor plants. Finally, there was a settlement, a 6-month contract, leaving many questions unsettled, but recognizing that from now on the company would have to deal not with individuals, but with a union. The sit-downs were especially dangerous to the system because they were not controlled by the regular union. It was to stabilize the system in the face of labor unrest that the Wagner Act of 1935, setting up a National Labor Relations Board, had been passed. Unions were not wanted by employers, but they were more controllable, more stabilizing for the system than the wildcat strikes, the factory occupations of the rank and file. Thus, 2 sophisticated ways of controlling direct labor action developed in the mid-30s. First, the National Labor Relations Board would give unions legal status, listen to them, settling certain of their grievances. Thus, it could moderate labor rebellion by channeling energy into elections, just as the constitutional system channeled possibly troublesome energy into voting. And second, the workers' organization itself, the union, even a militant and aggressive union like the CIO, would channel the workers' insurrectionary energy into contracts, negotiations, union meetings, and try to minimize strikes in order to build large, influential, even respectable organizations. The Supreme Court declared sit-downs to be illegal, and state governments were passing laws to hamper strikes, picketing, and boycotts. The coming of World War II weakened the old labor militancy of the 30s because the war economy created millions of new jobs at higher wages. The New Deal had succeeded only in reducing unemployment from 13 million to 9 million. It was the war that put almost everyone to work, and the war did something else: patriotism. The push for unity of all classes against enemies overseas made it harder to mobilize anger against the corporations. Okay, beautiful humans, this is the final video for chapter 15. The 30s and 40s showed more clearly than before the dilemma of working people in the US. The system responded to workers' rebellions by finding new forms of control, internal control by their own organizations as well as outside control by law enforcement. But along the new controls came new concessions. These concessions didn't solve basic problems. For many people, they solved nothing, but they helped enough people to create an atmosphere of progress and improvement to restore some faith in the system. The minimum wage of 1939, which established the 40-hour work week and outlawed child labor, left many people out of its provisions and set very low minimum wages, 25 cents an hour the first year. But it was enough to dull the edge of resentment. Housing was built for a small percentage of people who needed it. A modest, even parsimonious beginning, Paul Conkin says. But the sight of federally subsidized housing projects, playgrounds, vermin-free apartments, replacing dilapidated tenements was refreshing. The Social Security Act gave retirement benefits and unemployment insurance and matched state funds for mothers and dependent children, but it excluded farmers, domestic workers, and old people and offered no health insurance. As Conkin says, the meager benefits of Social Security were insignificant in comparison to the building of security for large established businesses. The New Deal gave federal money to put thousands of writers, artists, actors, and musicians to work in a federal theater project, a federal writers project, a federal art project. Murals were painted on public buildings, plays were put on for working class audiences who had never seen a play, hundreds of books and pamphlets were written and published, people heard a symphony for the first time. It was an exciting flowering of arts for the people, such as had never happened before in American history, and which has not been duplicated since. When the New Deal was over, capitalism remained intact. The rich still controlled the nation's wealth, as well as its laws, courts, police, newspapers, churches, colleges. Enough help had been given to enough people to make Roosevelt into a hero for millions, but the same system that had brought depression and crisis, the system of waste, of inequality, of concern for profit over human need, remained. For Black people, the New Deal was psychologically encouraging, but most Blacks were ignored by the New Deal programs. As tenant farmers, as farm laborers, as migrants, as domestic workers, they didn't qualify for unemployment insurance, minimum wages, Social Security, or farm subsidies. Roosevelt, careful not to offend Southern white politicians whose political support he needed, did not push a bill against lynching. In Harlem Hospital in 1939, proportionately twice as many people died as in Bellevue Hospital, which was in the white area downtown. So there is a poem here titled Let America Be America Again, written by Langston Hughes, that I'm not going to read, but I will post a picture of the poem after I finish this video, so that way you can read it yourself. To white Americans of the 30s, however, North and South blacks were invisible. Blacks were still being used as strike breakers, but now there were also attempts to bring blacks and whites together against their common enemy. So here there's a story that a woman, Molly Lewis, wrote in The Crisis about her experience in a steel strike in Gary, Indiana, where basically black and white people were coming together, they were eating together, they were striking together. They realized that it was the common cause for all of them to strike. So to close out this chapter, it says, many Americans began to change their thinking in those days of crisis and rebellion. In Europe, Hitler was on the march. Across the Pacific, Japan was invading China. The Western empires were being threatened by new ones. For the US, war was not far off. It's clear that chapter 16 will likely be about World War II. The United States gets out of a war, gives itself a few years, bam, it's in another one. So yeah, let me know what y'all think about this chapter. I'll talk to you soon. Thank you for being here. Sending you a big hug, and I hope you have a fantastic day.